everyone, it's Melissa, and today I am sharing with you the 4 books that I read in January. The first book that I finished was Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I have been looking forward to reading this trilogy, the Farseer trilogy, for a very long time, so I am so happy that I have finally read this. I do think that I am going to have to look at the trilogy as a whole. I don't think this is it stands on its own 2 feet type of a book. Although I did enjoy the book in and of itself, it did very much feel like a building towards something kind of a book. You are spending a lot of time learning about the characters, and there's a lot of time world building and learning about the history of this land and its peoples. And there's not a whole lot else besides that world building and getting to know the characters. There is a little bit of a plot, but most of it is packed towards the end. So I would say there's probably a little bit of a pacing issue where it's very slow for a while and then speeds up towards the end. Although I don't mind a slow-moving book, so it didn't really bother me. The book is about a young boy called Fitz, and he is the illegitimate son of one of the princes of this kingdom. So he is sent to live when he's quite young at the keep, but he is not a part of the family. He is being raised by the stable master. Raised, I use that term very loosely. And then he is, as the title would suggest, eventually apprenticed to be the king's assassin. So like I said, a lot of this book is in the world building, and I think the world building is excellent. The world feels very detailed and very lived in. There's also a slight horror element. There's some eerie stuff happening as part of the buildup of the plot that doesn't really get resolved, but I am assuming is going to be part of the overall narrative of the 3 books. Love the world building and looking forward to continuing the trilogy. The next book that I read was Fabled Passages by Margaret Pinard. This is a book of short stories with speculative or fantasy elements. So for example, there's immortality in one, there's some time travel, there's some animal POV. And I would say that the tone of the book is not very sci-fi. The tone feels more historical, which makes sense because Margaret writes historical fiction, and there were many kind of history type elements throughout. Not all of the stories, some felt perhaps more contemporary, but I would say for a lot of them, there is either an element of history or they're very clearly set in the past. See again, time travel, or it might be unclear when it's set, but it kind of feels like maybe an alternate history or something like that. So I would say that's more so the tone. There's some speculative elements, but it feels very historical. The stories that I liked the most tended to be the longer ones, because you get to get into the character's head more, or there's more world building or more room for description and that kind of thing. And I think that helps more with some of the historical elements too. So if you want to support indie author, please check out Margaret Pinard's channel. She has a booktube channel / authortube channel. Or if you want to support indie authors in general, Margaret also does a really good job of like collaborating and showcasing and creating a community of indie authors on YouTube. So I will make sure to link her channel below. The next book I read was Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. This I have a full video on, so I will link that. It's a spoiler-free video. It's not necessarily a review. It's more so just some thoughts I had about some of the elements and themes that I thought were particularly interesting in this book. It's a very beautifully written book, definitely character-driven, very slow and descriptive, and I felt like the writing had this feeling of almost like vulnerability to it, but with a somewhat funny edge to it. I would almost say dark comedy. I don't think this is strictly speaking a dark comedy, but there is humor kind of imbued in the book, even though it's quite dark. This is about a woman in her 60s, a Polish woman. She lives in this remote area, this remote village on this plateau, very close to the Czech border. She's really into astrology, and she's been charting, and one of her neighbors dies. This kickstarts the main thread, the plot of the novel, is that one of her neighbors dies, and then after that, a series of deaths occur, and she puts forward this theory that it is the animals who are taking revenge, because her neighbor who dies first is a hunter, and he poached and in some illegal things, and the night that they find him dead, it looked like he choked on a deer bone from a deer that he had poached. She saw a herd of deer outside of his house right after this had happened. So she gets this idea that the deer took revenge on him. So that's the plot in a nutshell. More people end up dead, and it's unclear exactly what's going on. Although that is the plot, this book is very, very much about the character. She's branded as a bit of a crazy old lady by everyone, and she definitely is odd. She's very determined, self-assured, not afraid to ruffle some feathers. So that is Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. And the last book that I read in January is Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. And the subtitle is Medicine and What Matters in the End. So Atul Gawande is a doctor. He's a surgeon. And this book I thought was going to be about death. Well, it is about death. I thought it was going to be primarily about that last stage of life. But I would say a good half of the book deals more so with the aging process and care of the elderly and autonomy in old age, and talks about nursing homes and assisted living and the lack of gerontologists, increase in disability as you age, and how that impacts your life. The book in a nutshell is about how the medical system, but also I think society as a whole, at least in the US and Canada and similar countries, is how we have blinders up to death, that we just want to shut it out and not think about it. The way the current medical system is set up, and how doctors are trained to think, is to prolong life and to prevent death and stave off death, no matter the cost, pretty much. And this book really tries to shift that thinking into what really matters in the end, and that's quality. It's the goals that someone has for their life. It's how they want their last days to be lived out. And is buying more time going to afford them that? Or is having them pain-free, or having their health managed in a way that's not thinking about prolonging life, but about getting as many good days as possible at the end of your life? It is very well written, chock full of really great information. I could read many excerpts from this, but there's just one I wanted to share because it was one of those things that kind of blew my mind. I have been part of the death positivity movement, death acceptance movement, for many years, and I am not ignorant to this topic, but this really did blow my mind. He's talking about a study in 2010 where they were looking at cancer patients, and half of the patients received the normal round of treatment, whatever the treatment was for their specific situation, chemotherapy, what have you, and the other half also received typical treatment, but in addition, they were given visits with a palliative care specialist. So these specialists, and now I'm reading, discussed with the patients their goals and priorities for if and when their condition worsened. The result: those who saw a palliative care specialist stopped chemotherapy sooner, entered hospice far earlier, experienced less suffering at the end of their lives. And they lived 25% longer. That was the kicker for me. I think anyone would guess that if you're seeing a palliative care specialist, that you would have reduction of suffering, and it's no surprise that those patients stopped chemotherapy sooner or that they entered hospice sooner. But it absolutely, at least to me, was a complete shock that they also lived 25% longer than the other group of patients. Reading again, in other words, our decision-making in medicine has failed so spectacularly that we have reached the point of actively inflicting harm on patients rather than confronting the subject of mortality. It's not just the general public. Doctors are afraid to talk to patients about death. It makes people uncomfortable. I could choose a dozen other excerpts like that. Highly recommend this book. Those are the books that I read in January. As always, if you want to share your thoughts on these books, whether you've read them or they're on your TBR, or now you're putting them on your TBR, please leave a comment below. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and we'll chat soon. Take care. Bye.